Hi, everybody. I am super excited to be chatting today and very excited to be invited today about a really cool, what I consider a really cool driving change spotlight. And so I'm going to share my screen. As was explained, I actually do a lot of different topics in terms of concussion research. And this is one that I think is a gap. And so I'm excited to be sharing it with you guys today. Over the course of the day, we've talked a lot about concussion management, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time going through these different aspects, but virtually you have an element of individuals participating usually within a team who come up with different knowledge and experiences. There's the athlete, the parent, and the coach. And these individuals, you generally provide them education. If it's required or indicated, you do baseline testing. You think about in your setting, do you have access to athletic therapy or an allied health professional? And then if a concussion takes place, there's reporting, removal, confirmation, and then management. And you've heard this before. Every concussion is unique. If you've seen one concussion, you've seen one concussion. But I'm going to get you to focus on something other than the concussion itself. And that's that the individual experience and demographic factors that an individual brings to that concussion experience matter within their context and setting. And context can include geographical, epidemiological, social cultural, social economic, ethical, legal, and political. And what makes concussion so complex is it is medically managed, and we do have to consider health equity. What do I mean when I talk about health equity? Well, there's a number of factors that go into understanding health equity, and only some of these have been examined with concussion. So some of the presentations and some of the infographics have talked about age. Some of them have talked about sex versus gender. We've learned a little bit about income in the recent days, but a lot of these other factors have received almost very little attention in the research sphere. And one particular item that has really interested me in the last little bit because of how important it is to me personally is one of race and ethnicity. And so I'm going to focus my driving change spotlight on how we can move forward in this. So before we begin, let's talk about ethnicity and race in healthcare in general. So within medical education and health research, race and ethnicity is conceptualized primarily as a biological construct instead of a social construct. And unfortunately, even today, some medical-based decisions and clinical cutoffs are made based off racial classifications. And it's important to recognize that experiences of discrimination, racism, and historical trauma are important social determinants of health for certain groups, including Indigenous, LGBTQ, and Black Canadians. Now, unfortunately, the evidence on race and concussion is incredibly limited, and it's primarily based in the United States. And one of the challenges with this is that the studies classify ethnicity differently than we would. So some of their studies classify as Hispanic, non-Hispanic, and they classify race differently. So more simply is in terms of race, white and Black, and there are challenges with this. But let's contextualize it as it relates to concussion. So what the research shows us from the United States is that if you take two elements, for example, of the concussion management sequence, specifically, let's say concussion education and reporting, some studies have come up to show that white parents and athletes score higher in concussion knowledge assessments than Black parents and athletes. This is in the States specifically. And some show that knowledge affects athlete disclosure, but it's mixed with race. There's no prediction in terms of race and behavior. We've also looked at some studies with baseline testing, and I know baseline testing is controversial. It depends on your setting, but when we talk about baseline testing, one of the things that people talk about is neuropsychological testing. And when a clinician looks at this neuropsychological test, they might stratify it by age, they might stratify based off education level, on gender, but what about race? And it's interesting because there's been a few studies that have looked at baseline performance on some of these measures, and again, it's mixed. And when we take a look at some of the management section in terms of racial differences in imaging following CT and clinical outcomes, we do find that there are racial differences. For example, if we take a look at a study by Yanko Khan, they found that individuals, those who identify as white, have longer symptom resolution, they take more days off school, and they actually report different post-concussion activities. So there does seem to be some interesting factors here. But I say this all with a caveat, because While many of these studies that I've just talked about look at racial differences, there are many factors that can confound this specific outcome measure. And these are often not measured in the study. So something like socioeconomic status, education level, quality of education, reading level, or acculturation can all impact whether race is a factor. More importantly, I would argue Canada is not the same as the States. So Canada has a rich ethnic and cultural heritage. So over 250 ethnic origins were reported. 4 in 10 Canadians report more than one origin. We have more racial categories. So this categorization of Black versus white doesn't necessarily apply to our population here. And while we don't have very much information specific to concussion, we do have evidence on health inequities in our healthcare system. So systemic racism, underrepresentation of visual minorities in leadership positions, and negative health experiences based off race. For example, when you asked minorities their experience of discrimination based off color and race, this is their self-reported experiences, almost 50% of those identifying as Black say that they've experienced some form of discrimination, and it's pretty high among those who identify as a minority. There's also many opportunities for social demographic factors like race to affect individuals with concussion. This can be in the patient-parent relationship, the coach-athlete relationship, how parental anxiety manifests, fear of liability in terms of the clinician, communication challenges, or access to care. These are just a few of the different Canadian differences that could result in racial disparities. We only have one province with legislation outlining concussion education, so disparity in access to education. We have less resources dedicated to sports in Canada than the United States does, and many teams don't have access to allied healthcare professionals. Family physicians may not be educated. We have lengthy wait times. Weekly visits may not be possible. And when we talk about some of the ongoing symptoms that can occur with concussion, this is a very complex care plan with interdisciplinary management. Many of these resources are not covered or have long waiting lists. So when it comes to race in Canada and concussion, there is a huge gap. So what do we need to do? For one, I think we need further studies that better understand how social demographic factors like race and ethnicity play into concussion management in Canada. And that involves not only looking at race, but the whole picture of health inequity. We need to also understand the nuances of perception communication and relationship between the provider, the parent, the patient, the coach, and how those impact concussion management. And we need to work together to embrace equity, diversion, and inclusion practices. These are some actionable items that I would suggest that you think about if you're a stakeholder working in the sport environment. Is my concussion protocol culturally sensitive, inclusive, and taking into account unique needs and experiences of athletes with diverse cultural backgrounds? What does that mean? Do we have cultural competence? Do you have an understanding of the cultural beliefs and values of the communities you work with? Are you aware of microaggressions? Are your protocols accessible to the languages spoken by your community? Did you include an inclusive and diverse community in the development of your protocol? And do you provide education and outreach that is culturally sensitive? And most importantly, I'm going to suggest for this Driving Change Spotlight, we continue this conversation. And with that, I thank you for your time on our quick Driving Change Spotlight.
That was awesome. Thank you, Amanda. Always informative. And I'm glad you identified this gap, because it's nice to hear what research has been happening, but it's also nice to hear what research could be happening. So thank you. So I have one question for you, just because we're running tight on time, but it's not a lack of interest in your topic, because there's lots of conversation going on in the room in here about about the research you're highlighting here. So one question for you, Amanda: are there any simple tools or measures that a sport organization or researchers could use to measure demographics relative to concussion data?
Yeah, I think that one of the challenges we have is that we don't measure it. And so Stats Canada does have some validated measures they use to measure demographic values. I would probably start there, and then really understanding your population. So not only asking about their age and their gender, but having conversations about how things like cultural beliefs, religious beliefs, their personal experience may be impacting their experience.
That's great. Thank you so much, Amanda. And enjoy the rest of your afternoon and the rest of the session here.